Today I'm going to show you how to make the line drawstring bag. So this is the free tutorial size, but it is also the everything size in my line drawstring bag pattern. I'll have both of those, the tutorial and the pattern, linked in the description down below. We're going to go through everything from cutting to finishing the bag. But yeah, just to give you an idea, if you have not seen the tutorial, it's just a flat bottom drawstring bag, pretty simple. It's fully lined, and we're also going to make our own ties. So let's go ahead and get started. This is what you'll need to sew the line drawstring bag. You'll want a copy of the pattern or the tutorial handy. You'll need your fabric, a cutting mat and long ruler. I also like to have on hand when I'm making this bag a 12.5 inch and 6.5 inch square ruler. Not necessary, but they come in handy. You'll want a rotary cutter, snips, seam ripper, marking pen, coordinating thread, pins, and a large safety pin. I also like to use 1-inch masking tape too, but that is optional. Beyond that, you'll need a sewing machine that either has a 1/4 inch foot or you can easily set a 1/4 inch seam, and you'll need an iron and an ironing board. In this video, I'll be making the everything size, which is the same size as the free tutorial, but the instructions and techniques that we use will apply to any of the sizes in the pattern. So I've started by ironing all my fabrics. I've also squared up one edge, so I have a nice clean edge to start my cutting from. So the pattern and the tutorial both utilize a method called subcutting, which means we're going to cut a strip from the fabric and then cut our two pieces down out of that strip. So this is the fabric I'm using for my exterior main. It is a one-way directional print, which means it has a clear top and bottom. And so if I follow the instructions for cutting, my print will be cut correctly. So I'm going to start by lining up my nice clean cut edge at 0 on my cutting mat. And I need to cut a 9-inch by 21-inch strip. So I have a fat quarter that's 21 inches. I'm going to line my ruler up at 9 inches. And I'm going to cut all the way down. This is scrap and we don't need that. So now I have two clean edges. I'm going to measure it just to see how much wiggle room I have. Okay, it's a little bit over 22 inches. That's great. Now I'm going to take that 12.5 inch ruler and I'm going to use the ruler to make the rest of my measurements. So what I want to do, I want to start by getting rid of this selvage. This edge is clean and this edge is clean, so I can line my ruler. I'm not using the mat to measure. I can line my ruler right up on the strip, clean up that edge. Oops. Clean up that edge. Okay, so now I'm going to start cutting my pieces. I'm going to flip this strip around just because I'm right-handed. It's a little bit easier. Okay, and now I need to cut a 9-inch by 10.5 inch piece. So this measurement is already 9 inches, so I need to cut 10.5 inches in this direction. Again, I'm using the ruler. I've lined it up at 10.5, and it's 9 inches tall. Carefully make that cut, and I've got my first exterior main piece. And now I'm just going to do that again with the rest of the strip. And this little bit that is left over is just a scrap. We don't need that in our final bag. So there we go. I have my two exterior main pieces all cut out and ready. So now let's cut the accent. So again, I squared up this edge. I'm going to line it up at 0 on my mat. And I need to cut a 4-inch by 21-inch strip. So I'm going to line my ruler up at 4 inches on the mat. Okay, this is scrap that I don't need. got, let's see, I've got 22 inches, so I have plenty of room. I'm going to make a small cut here at the end just to clean up that edge. Again, I'm using the 12.5-inch ruler. I'm not measuring on the mat. So now I need to cut 2 4-inch by 10.5-inch pieces. So I'm going to line up this nice clean cut edge at 10.5. And we've got our first exterior accent piece. And now I will repeat that for the second piece. That's scrap. And now we have our 2 accent pieces cut. We're just going to repeat this same process for the lining. I've got a fat quarter. Again, I've already squared off this edge, so I can line that up right against 0 on my mat. Now we need to cut a 12.5-inch strip by 21 inches. Okay, so I'm lined up at 12.5. This is scrap we don't need. Okay, let's see what we have to work with. Yep, we've got plenty of room. It's a little over 22 inches with the selvage, so let's clean up this cut edge. Again, I'm going to use my 12.5-inch ruler, which is the perfect size for this job. Lining it up on my 2 clean edges. Trim away that extra. All right. So now I need to cut 2 10.5-inch by 12.5-inch pieces. Oops. So this is my 12.5, and I'm gonna line this up at 10.5. Okay. All right, we've got our first lining piece. And now we'll do the same with what's left. That's scrap. And now we have our 2 lining pieces cut. Last thing to cut is our ties. I'm going to make ties for this bag, but you're welcome to use twill or ribbon or paracord. But I wanted to show you how to make ties too. So I've got my tie fabric. I've already cleaned up this edge. This is a full little like fat 1/8, or I'm sorry, it's a full 1/8 of the yard. I'm gonna line up my clean edge at 0, grab my long ruler, and I'm gonna cut 2 2-inch strips from this. Okay, so there's my first one. Set that aside. And now I'm just going to line this back up at 0 and measure to 2 inches again. Okay, so now we have our 2 strips. I want to trim off these selvages so that we can cut our ties. I'm just using my ruler again, not the mat. And I'm cutting through both layers right now of this strip. Now we need to trim these down to 32 inches. So just gonna line this up at 0. And cut at 32. So there's one strip. And another strip at 32 inches. And this is just leftover scrap. So now we have both of our ties cut. And with that, we're done cutting. The first step in putting together our bags is we need to lay all of our pieces out into one long line. And we're able to do that because all of their pieces have one measurement in common, and that's the width. So for the exterior, or for the everything bag / free tutorial size, that is 10.5 inches. So our exterior main is 10.5 inches wide, our exterior accent's 10.5 inches wide, and our lining pieces are 10.5 inches wide. Now we're going to arrange all these pieces, and they do need to be arranged in a specific order so that all the pieces are lined up right, and also all of our directional prints are lined up right so that they're not upside down in our finished bag. So we're going to start with a lining piece, then add an exterior accent, and this is the 10.5 inch width measurement that we're lining those up together. Then we're going to add an exterior main piece. Now, if you're using a directional piece for your exterior accent, you want the top of your print to be touching the lining, because this is going to end up being the top edge of your bag when it's finished. Similarly, if you're using a directional fabric like I am for the exterior main, you want the top of your print to be touching the accent, and the bottom of your print is going to be down here, because this is going to be the bottom of your bag when we're finished. So now that we have one half laid out, we're going to lay the second half of the bag out basically as a mirror image. So let's scoot this down so that we can get it all in the frame. So we're going to start with an exterior main piece, then an exterior accent piece, and our remaining lining piece. So again, I've got my directional print for my exterior main. I've got the top of the print touching the accent. The bottom of the print is touching the other exterior main, because this will be the bottom of the bag. If I was using a directional accent piece, I would have the top edge of the print towards the lining and the bottom of the print towards the exterior main. So now I'm going to sew all 5 of these seams. I like to just start at one edge. I'm just going to flip this down so the right side's together. And I'm going to sew right along this edge with a 1/4 inch seam. You can pin it if you need to. And then once I've got that sewn, I'll just bring it right back over and then flip it down again to add the next piece. And I'm going to continue doing that until all of the pieces are sewn together, and then we will move on to the next step. Once all of your pieces are sewn into one long strip, you're going to want to press all of your seams. So I've already done that. I've got them all pressed open. And now we're going to fold our strip in half. So now when you kind of open it up a little bit, you'll see the linings are touching, the accents are touching, and the exterior mains are touching. So now we're going to pin along all 3 of our open sides. So I just got my straight pins here. And I like to start at the seams, because I know I want those to be nice and lined up. So I'll put a pin through that seam. Line these 2 up. And then I'm going to do the same down here on this side of the bag. And now I'm just going to add some pins throughout the rest of the bag. I don't add a ton of pins, but obviously feel free to use as many pins as you would like. Two over here. Now when I pin this lining end, this is going to be the inside of the bottom of your bag. So I like to go ahead and with my pins mark out the opening that I'm going to leave for turning. I like to leave, like on this size, you know, I'll maybe leave like about a 3-inch opening. I don't measure anything. I just know I want it to be in the center and I don't want it to be too big. So now we have our piece all pinned, and the next thing we need to do is mark an opening on both sides of the accent for the drawstring casing. So let's go ahead and do that. I like to use my little 6.5-inch ruler here, but any ruler will do. What we're going to do, we're going to mark, we want to leave a 1-inch opening in the center of the accent for our drawstring casing. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to measure from this seam to this seam. So that's 3.5 inches. Half of 3.5 is 1 3/4. So that's right here. I'm going to mark that with a pin. Okay. And now I'm going to measure 1/2 inch on either side of the pin and make a mark. So 1/2 inch on that side and 1/2 inch on that side. So now when I go to sew, I will leave this gap open. So let's repeat that down here. I've got 3.5 inches. The center of that is 1 3/4. Now I'm going to make a mark 1/2 inch, oops, 1/2 inch from that side of the pin, and then 1/2 inch from this side of the pin. So now I have my drawstring casing opening on both sides. I also marked my bottom opening in my lining for turning with pins, and now I'm going to sew all the way around these 3 open sides, not sewing between our marks. So I'll sew from here to the first mark, back stitch and cut my threads. Then I'll start again here, back stitch, sew all the way to the corner, turn that corner, sew to the edge of my opening, back stitch. I'll cut my threads and start sewing again here, back stitch, turn the corner, come all the way down this side, stop here and back stitch, cut my threads. I'll start again at this mark, back stitch, and sew all the way to the end and back stitch. So I'm gonna do that and I'll bring it back and show you what it looks like all sewn up. Okay, and here's what it looks like all sewn. So I've sewn around all 3 sides, leaving the 2 openings for the drawstring casing in my accent and an opening in the lining for turning. Next, we are going to sew the gussets. So this is what is going to give your bag a flat bottom. And we're gonna do this to both exterior corners and both interior corners. So I'm gonna start with one of the inside corners. And basically what we're gonna do, you want your hands on either side of this lining here. And we're going to pull these 2 layers apart. And you can see this triangle shape automatically wants to form. So what we want to do is we want to be able to get this seam here and this seam here lined up with each other. So the way that I like to do that is just get my thumb, get it between my finger and my thumb, and I can kind of feel I can rub them between my fingers and I can feel when they lock together. So I'm gonna do that pretty far down so that I have enough room to work with. So I can feel all the way up, these two seams are lined up. And so they're basically nestled. And so this seam is facing this direction, this seam is facing this direction. And so when they meet in the middle, they kind of nestle together. So once I get those lined up how I want them, I'm just gonna lay it down flat on my mat, nice and flat. And what we're going to do now is we're gonna measure a line across this corner. And that measurement is gonna be different for the different sizes, but since we're making the tutorial size, this line that we're gonna measure is going to be 3 inches. So the way to measure that and to double check that everything is lined up properly, we're gonna use a ruler that has a 45-degree angle line on it. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna line up this angle line with this angle of our fabric, okay? And we're going to slide it up along that edge until it is 3 inches across this corner. Now you can double check again that everything is correct because this will be 3 inches, and from the edge of the ruler to the very corner edge of this fabric will be half of that. So in our case here, it's 1.5 inches. So I know everything is square and lined up, and I'm gonna go ahead and mark my line across this corner. Okay, and then before it gets too moved around, I'm going to secure it with a couple of pins. Okay, let's do a second one just to reiterate. Okay, so I've got, this is my other lining corner. I'm going to pull these 2 layers apart. And I like to pull them down pretty far just so that I have plenty of room to get everything flat. I'm going to put these seams between my 2 fingers and slide them over so they're nice and locked into place. Another thing you can do if you're nervous that it's not lined up is hold it up against a window. It's pretty easy to see if your seams are not lined up together, but that feels good. So I'm going to lay it out flat. Okay, then bring over my ruler and line up that 45-degree with this angled corner until we're at 3 inches across. And I can double check my measuring from the line I'm gonna draw to the tip of that corner is 1.5 inches, half of 3. So that looks good. I'm gonna mark my line and then secure that with a couple pins. So I'm gonna repeat that with both of my exterior corners. So same thing, I'll pull these apart, I'll mark my line, and then once I like to pin them and mark them all first. And then what I'm going to do is just sew right on top of the line that we marked for each corner. All right, I have all of my corners sewn, so both of my lining corners and both of my exterior corners. And now what I want to do is I want to trim off some of this extra fabric that we don't need. I'm gonna grab a bigger pair of scissors, but your snips will work too. So I want roughly 1/4 inch left on this side of the seam, but honestly I don't measure, so I'm just gonna kind of eyeball it. But definitely you want to cut on this side of the seam, not on this side, otherwise you'll cut your seam off. So cut that one, cut that one. Our 2 lining corners. All right, so now we are ready to turn this bag right sides out. So I'm gonna use this opening in the lining that we left, stick my hand in, and I'm grabbing the bottom corner of the exterior and pulling it through that hole. And now we basically just want to kind of fluff this to get it completely turned right side out. All right, and now we are ready to close up this opening in the lining. So I'm just going to tuck those raw edges in and start securing that with some pins. And I like to put a pin right at the start and end of the opening. That way when I'm sewing it, I know exactly where to start and stop. So I'll put one on either end, and then I usually just put like one in the middle. And if you want, you can press this to get it a little flatter. So now I'm gonna take this over to my machine, and I'm just gonna use like an 1/8 of an inch seam, start about 1/4 of an inch before the opening starts, sew all the way across, and end it on the other side of that pin. So I will go sew that up. All right, I have my opening all closed up. So now it's time to push the lining into the exterior of the bag. So I'm just going to pull these 2 layers apart and push the lining inside the bag. And again, a good shake kind of helps make that a little easier. I like to get my fingers in both little kind of corner edges here in the lining to line up better with the exterior, and the same with on this side. And then you just want to even out this top edge so that the seam is right at the very top. Nothing too fancy, just giving it a nice finger press. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Okay, so next we're gonna want to press this edge with an iron, and then we will sew our drawstring casing. Okay, we've got our top edge all nice and pressed. I've kind of pressed the side a little bit while I pressed that, so it's all nice and flat. And now what we need to do is mark the drawstring casing opening so that we can sew all the way around the bag and create the casing. So I'm just sticking my finger in this little opening, and I'm gonna use a marking pen to just make a real small little mark right at the top of that opening. And then I'm gonna do the same at the bottom. Nothing too major. All right, and now I'm gonna do the same on the other side. So I'm gonna stick my finger in the opening, mark the top, and mark the bottom. Now, if you'd like, you can extend those lines all the way across the bag. So just use a nice long ruler and line up the top of that mark with the mark on this side and draw a line all the way across there. Same with the bottom. And then when you go to sew your casing, you'll just sew right on top of the line. But I'm gonna show you another way. It's my preferred method, and that is what the 1-inch masking tape is for. So let's go over to the machine and I'll show you how I do that. Okay, now we're going to sew our drawstring casings. Now, my machine does not have a free arm, which means I can't remove part of this machine base in order to fit a tube around it. So I will have to turn this inside out and sew from the inside with the loop above. But if you have a regular sewing machine that has a free arm, you won't have to do that part. But either way, go ahead and change your stitch length to whatever you would typically use for top stitching. I set mine to 3. And what we want to do is put our needle right into this little mark that we made right at the top of one of our casing openings. So I've got a 1/4 inch foot on here, by the way. Okay, so I'm right on top of that mark. Now, if you did mark your lines all the way along, then you're good to go. Just get your machine, get your needle lined up on the mark and sew all the way along on that line, backstitching when you start and finish. All right, so I've got, excuse me, I've got that all lined up. I can double check by lowering my needle, but yeah, it looks pretty good. And since I don't have any lines here marked to keep myself straight, this is where the 1-inch masking tape comes in. And if you don't have 1 inch, it's not a big deal. You'll just have to move it to do the other side of the casing. So I'm gonna get this, I think that looks relatively straight. I don't worry too much about it, but I'm going to lay this masking tape. You can use washi tape, whatever won't ruin your machine bed. I'm lining this masking tape up right along this edge because I already have the foot lined up right where I want it. And now I can use this tape as a guide when I sew my casing. So I'm going to start stitching. I'm going to back stitch, and I'm going to sew all the way around. And I'm just going to keep this top edge lined up as best as I can with this masking tape. Nope, I'm getting a little bit off course, but that's okay. Slow down as I meet my other end of my stitching. And now I'm paying less attention to the masking tape and just more attention to that stitching, the back stitch. And I'm gonna cut my threads. And I'll actually go ahead and cut these tails too so they're not in our way. Okay, so since I used 1-inch masking tape, I can now just line up the top edge of my bag right with the edge of the masking tape. Again, I'm going to make sure my needle is going to hit right on that mark, or pretty close to it. And now I can start again and do this side of the casing. So I'm going to back stitch. I'm just going to keep everything nice and flat and use the edge of this tape to keep myself lined up. Now, if you didn't have 1-inch masking tape, you would just need to get yourself set up like you did before, line up the foot with the mark, and then move your masking tape so that the edge of the masking tape is up against the top of your bag. So, pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and then we're going to make some ties. Now it's time to make the ties. I'm going to get my machine set up with a Okay, now it's time to make the ties. What we want to first do is turn under the short edge on both sides of both strips, and we're going to just top stitch along that edge to secure it. So I have my stitch length set to 3, but any top stitch length that you're comfortable works fine. And I'm just going to use a little short 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and sew right across this. Okay, so again, I'm going to do that to the other end of this strip and then repeat for the other tie, and next we'll press it. Now we're going to start pressing our ties. So this will be the same for both ties, but I'll just demonstrate on one. So the first thing we're going to do is fold it in half lengthwise. And I like to kind of fold it and press it as I go. I'm using steam, but certainly you don't have to. Do whatever you prefer in terms of pressing. I'm just going to continue to press this entire strip. Okay, so now the whole thing has been pressed in half. Now we want to open it back up and fold both of these raw edges into the center crease that we just created. So, careful not to burn yourself. I'm talking to you and me. Okay. And you may choose to just do one side at a time. That can be a little bit easier. But I'm going to live on the edge and do both at the same time. I just kind of, once you get it started, it's really not so bad. And I kind of just do a few inches at a time. It starts to kind of want to fold into the center on its own. Okay, I'm just going to continue on down the entire length of the tie. Watch out, your ironing board will get a little hot doing this. It's a little bit tedious, but it'll be worth it. Okay, so I've got the whole thing with all the edges into the center, and now I can fold it in half again. And I've now closed up, whoops. Now I have all those raw edges hidden away in the middle. Just keep pressing until you get to the very end. Okay, so now that's all pressed and ready to be sewn. We'll do the exact same thing with the other tie, and then we will sew this tie together. Okay, now that we have our strips all pressed, we need to close up this edge. So we're gonna do that just by top stitching all along the whole length of the strip. So let's go ahead and get started. I still have my stitch length at 3. I'm going to do a little 1/8 inch seam allowance and just go relatively slow to make sure I keep it on track. Just want to slow down as you approach the end. Make sure it's not going to get wonky. Okay, that's it. All done. So now we'll just repeat this for the other tie, and then we can assemble our drawstring bag. Time for the final step. So we have our drawstring bag is to the point where we have our casing sewn, and we are ready to insert our drawstrings into the casing. This is where the big safety pin comes in. So we're gonna do one string at a time. I like to put my safety pin through the tie twice. That way I don't create a hole in my drawstring. I'm going to start on one side, and I'm going to insert the safety pin into the opening and start feeding it through. So I kind of hold the bottom of the safety pin with this thumb and then push the excess fabric with this finger. So when you get to the casing on the other side, you're just gonna kind of wiggle your way past it and keep going. We're gonna come back out the opening that we started in. Okay. So we've made it all the way around. We can pull it through and remove the safety pin. We've got a little string there. And now we just want to make sure and feel like it feels like the tie is in there nice and flat. It's not twisted. So we can even out our ties. And then I like to just tie a little overhand knot to keep them secured together. And that's one side done. So now let's do the other side. So again, I'm gonna thread this onto my safety pin. And now I'm gonna start from the other opening. Same thing. I'm just gonna feed it right in. The only thing that's really different is that there's already a string in there. So, oops, I'm caught. There we go. There's already the first string in there, so it's just there's a little bit more fabric in there. It may be a little bit more difficult to go around, but not too bad. And then you just want to push your way past this opening in the string ends and continue all the way around back to the opening where you started. Come back out. Okay. Pull that out. We can remove our safety pin. And again, before we tie that off, I'm just gonna feel, make sure nothing's twisted in there. Doesn't feel like it, so that's good. And so we will just even out those ends and tie a little knot. And there we go. That is it. All done.